Okay, well, I'm sure more people are going to join us in due course, but for those of you who are here, just welcome to the launch of the book Horizon of Impossibilities, Possibilities, a chronicle of Brazil's conservative turn, which is edited by Katerina Hatzikidi and Eduardo Dullo. Before we start, I just want to go through the housekeeping format, which I guess a lot of you are familiar with this at the moment. We are recording this session, and I hope that's okay with you. We also have available at the bottom, if you wish to have the live transcript, you can also turn that on. Then in terms of the format, what we are going to do is, first of all, Katerina and Eduardo are going to say a few words about the book, and then we are going to invite our two commentators, Graham Daniel Willis and Carly Machado, who we're very, very grateful for joining us today, to say a few words, maybe more than a few words. And then we'll get Eduardo and Katerina to respond to that, and then we'll open it up to questions. And when it comes to questions, please, you can either put them in the chat or else you can raise your hand. I think that's probably it. I just wanted to say how absolutely delighted I am to be able to host this, because I've been with the project, I guess, from the beginning, although as I've just been saying to everybody before the meeting, I have done very little except encourage it along. The intellectual input and sort of financial support comes from elsewhere. But I think the project sort of began when Katerina was a stipendiary fellow at the Institute of Latin American Studies with her and was thinking about holding a conference with us. And then we joined with the Brazil Institute and also obtained money from Society of Latin American Studies to host a conference, which actually had the same title, I think, as the book, if I'm correct, I think. And so it's, you know, it's wonderful to see this book appear now to be published, but also that it's in our own series, the Institute of Latin American Studies Latin American series, which will, although some of you will know that we have had some sort of restructuring here at the Institute of Latin American Studies, but it continues as the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the book series, which we've been running, will continue. So I don't want to take up any more time. Over to you, either Katerina or Eduardo, if you'd like to say a few words before we start.
Thank you very much, Linda, for this very lovely introduction. And I would like to also thank Graham and Carly for being with us today. I will also extend my acknowledgements and thank you to Ainhoa Montoya for helping us organize this virtual launch, and to CLACS for the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies for hosting the event. And of course, to Jenny Stubbs from the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London, whose help was invaluable for in making this launch possible. I would like to just very briefly say a few words about how this book started. And as Linda just mentioned, the original idea, let's say, or maybe, the beginning of this book can be traced back to a seminar which I organized as a stipendiary fellow at ILAS at the time. So it was February 2019. It's been a while. And the seminar was titled A Horizon of Impossibilities, reflecting on the social implications of recent political upheaval in Brazil. So I had the great pleasure of organizing this event at the time with Linda Newson's and Anthony Pereira's indispensable help in organizing this seminar, because ILAS and King's Brazil Institute co-hosted the event. And it was kindly supported by the Society for Latin American Studies, so SLAS. And that event, as the title indicates, was or felt that it was a reaction to the surprise, or to a sense of surprise or even shock for some at the election, the 2019 presidential election result in Brazil. So organizing this seminar was an effort to invite a critical interdisciplinary discussion on recent political events in the country. And there are two main publication outcomes from that seminar. The first is a special issue with the Bulletin of Latin American Studies, BLAR, and the second is this volume which came out in September, and we will be discussing in more detail in this hour. So yeah, without further ado, I just wanted to mention that it was a great pleasure to be able to organize this this book, and I'm very honored also that Eduardo Dullo was happy to join me in this venture. And well, from the start, we had agreed on an approach. Both Eduardo and I think Eduardo can also compliment me on this. It seemed to us that despite the general feeling, Bolsonaro's election, far from being predictable or predetermined, was nonetheless not much of a surprise. So partly drawing on a persistent anthropological truism, we believe that change is always also in many crucial ways continuity. So in this case, we're examining, we saw that there were elements that pointed both to a major political shift and to historical continuities. And as Eduardo and I discussed in the introduction, we believe that it would be an error to attribute this electoral result to any one singular explanation, because it's a very complex phenomenon. And while we do place particular emphasis on Brazil's authoritarian tradition, the contributors to the volume complement this perspective by taking a very nuanced historical and ethnographic approach to flesh out both continuities and disruptions between the present moment and Brazil's political and historical and social history. So this book is essentially dedicated to understanding the specific conjuncture and historical conditions as well that enabled the rise and election of Jair Bolsonaro to Brazil's presidency. So I will just stop here. Perhaps Eduardo might want to add a few words, and thank you very much again to all for being with us today.
Eduardo, do you wish to add anything?
I would just add a couple words, just to say thank you, Katerina, for inviting me to join in the project. Thank you, Gran and Carly, for being here to discuss the book with us today. Everyone that's also here to join this discussion, and to mention, we have two authors here as well, Jessica Esclair and David Lemon. Thank you for being part of the book as well, and having being able to contribute with your chapters and research. Also to mention that Jessica chapter is amazing, and it's part of a discussion that she is also publishing in a whole volume. Her own book, her own monograph has just came out recently as well on Brazilian elites and their philanthropy, wealth, and at the service of development. So I will also recommend you to take a look at her monograph as well. And just to agree once more with Katerina and basically say that our interest was to avoid two things that might give us a sense of novelty, but also something that we believed would be misleading, to interpret or to analyze the situation as something that is explained by what happened in the United States or in several other countries as just another aspect of this conservative turn, and then we placed some emphasis on the history and on the particular trajectory of Brazilian situation that gives us something else to add to the discussion. The fact that we have a authoritarian tradition, the fact that we have a lot of inequalities that are persistent over time, and the authors also acknowledge that and show that in detail with the discussion on race, the discussion on the Quilombola situation, on indigenous people. So I believe that the book brings what is particular from Brazil into this global discussion as well. So I believe that everyone who is interested both in the more historical and continuity of inequality, and those who are interested in the novelty of the situation will both have something to learn and to read in the book. So that's it. I think this is something that we are proud about the book. So thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Now going to pass over to Carly, who I just want to introduce briefly. Carly Barbosa Machado is Professor of Anthropology at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. Forgive my terrible Portuguese, which I learnt via Spanish. With Patricia Berman, she coordinates the Disturbia Research Group, and she is editor of the journal Religião e Sociedade. Over to you, Carly.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for this opportunity, and also to join you in this meeting. It's nice to be here together, also celebrating this book. I think that's the meaning of this moment. And for this, I really want to thank Eduardo and Katerina, and also all people involved in this organization. So let's talk about the book. A Horizon of Impossibility is a book guided by two questions. How did we get there? As an invitation to the exercise of rethinking about the configuration of Brazil's conservative turn. And where are we going? A question about horizons ahead in order to evoke thoughts about future scenarios. As I had the opportunity to write some words about this book, I tried to organize my dialogue with editors and authors, adding two other questions to this provocative encounter. In relation to the question, how did we get there? I took some time to think about my first question, that was, who are we? Who constitute this we? Every analysis of political process deals with the formation of more or less fixed fields and positions. Starting from the questions, how did we get there? This volume points to an we that projects itself on different scales. We Brazilians, as some of us, we researchers dedicated to thinking about Brazilian society, and also a broader we, an international community which finds itself bewildered facing a wave of far-right authoritarian governments around the world. Certainly these we are made up of non-homogeneous aggregates of people and ideas, but they are assumed by this book for a reflective conversation about the conservative turn in Brazil and Jair Bolsonaro's rise to power. It's an effort to understand what's happening in contemporary Brazil, but also in global scale. But the exercise of trying to define who constitutes this we, puts the question of what unites us, and how far can this envelope be pushed. The support for Bolsonaro in Brazil after 2 years in office and a pandemic mobilized resources of most diverse orders, which, on one hand, consolidated him, and on the other, opened many fissures. The same is true of the opposition to his government. If the analysis that led us to the year of 2018 culminates in Jair Bolsonaro's victory, and are guided by it in order to explain the convergence of events that yield this electoral result, in 2021, year of this book's publication, in anticipation of the 2022 Brazilian presidential elections, the questions that arise are a little bit different. It's time to discuss the convergence that remain, the ruptures perceived so far, and how the fields of supporters of and opponents to Jair Bolsonaro are behaving politically. This volume already presents important pointers about this future moment and hence alludes to these horizons. My second question, in dialogue with the one about where are we going, formulated by the editors, was, but how do we move? I consider that this book contributes a lot, not only to thinking about the destination of political action, so where to, but also about their forms. How do we do it? The field of debate presented in this collective volume reveals a work that involves moral, communicational, and aesthetic dimensions of political mobilization. In this domain, something new has happened in Brazil in recent times and became more strongly visible in 2013 in the scope of street protests that took over the country and brought millions of Brazilians to the streets. The theme of political mobilization has taken on new contours since then, based on some questions that work well when articulated, but which also present quite different qualities. Questions like, what makes Brazilians take to the streets? Who has the capacity to organize protests? How are political collectivities organized? What's the role of political parties and social movements in recent years? What new collective actors are emerging in the political field? And how to understand the relationship between political mobilizations and electoral behaviors today? These and other questions are discussed through some overreaching themes in the work presented here. One of them is the theme of communication. The production and dissemination of narratives about truth has arisen as a silent issue in the public sphere. The effect of the construction and circulation of images for political communication reached another level of complexity from the moment digital environments became its main realm of activity. Research in and on social media became an empirical field of study for social science around the world, and the political agency of algorithms gained relevance. Institutions that spent some years as invisible actors of this digital political field started to be named and studied, and their activities and strategies documented and discussed. But the question remains, how do we move? Are the communication practices used by far-right conservative camps a model to be followed? Which political communication strategies makes people mobilize and in which directions? Is it possible to disentangle form from context in political communication? Can communication strategies be shared by the opposing camps? Thinking about communication and political mobilization implies making ethical and ideological decisions about the objectives of these mobilizations, urging people to the streets and to the formation of a long-lasting democratic field requires forms of political communication that are certainly very different, or at least should be very carefully and consistently combined. With us, come to my final comment on a theme which is fundamental to think about political mobilization: the centrality of the debate on moralities and how moralities are related to political horizons and possible futures. Race, gender, sexuality, family, and religion are recurrent themes in the varied chapters of this work, and structure an arena of political debates that configure entirely different possible and impossible horizons for Brazil in the coming years. The future desired in course today by a conservative far-right camp is radically different from that dreamed, imagined, and disputed by that part of Brazilian society that fights for a more democratic, just, and egalitarian country. Visions of the future move people and collectivities. Possible horizons are fundamental to political mobilization. The abduction of hope in the future is absolutely paralyzing. This book, A Horizon of Impossibilities, insists from beginning to end on an approach to Brazilian political reality as constituted by people, collectivities, and ideas in movement. The breadth of the movement may change, sometimes small steps, large actions, and also stops. Those who walk side by side may vary. The directions of the movement may be more or less uncertain, but there is a movement, and this work has its central political and epistemological positioning in the movement of people, collectivities, and ideas. And where there is movement, there are contested visions of the future. And where there is dispute, there is hope. And that's why we invite everybody to read this amazing work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. I think we'll move over to Graham next, and then we'll come back to Katerina and Eduardo later. Graham Daniel Willis is Associate Professor in Development Studies and Latin American Studies in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge, and he's also a Fellow of Queen's College. He's written extensively on politics and organized crime in Brazil, and has a new book. I'm doing a bit of advertising for you here, Graham. Has a new book coming out next year called Keep the Bones Alive, Missing People and the Search for Life in Brazil. So over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much, Linda. And especially to Katerina and Eduardo. It's a great pleasure really to be involved in this discussion and to have had the opportunity to kind of read the book in a more deep way than I might otherwise have done. So I wanted to reflect upon a couple of things. The first I would say is just really to send my great congratulations to both Katerina and Eduardo for the work that they've done to put this together, and indeed to all of the contributors who have made something that is remarkably coherent and important and interesting, and also very timely, which is not always what is done in academic work. So we have rigor, timeliness, conceptualization, attention to history and futures. The book really covers all of these bases in really excellent ways. So I second Carly in saying that it really is something that people should read and attend to in thinking about how we make sense of Brazil and why it matters and how it matters at this particular juncture. So I wanted to, in the minutes that I have, I wanted to do a couple of things. One is reflect a little bit on some of the work, but also to think a little bit about how it made me think, and I think how it makes the possibility for thinking about broader questions associated with this moment and why it matters. Because of course, we've covered an awful lot in this book, but it really does do a great job in pollinating other thought about how we should think about this further and other ways that we can advance the kind of the critiques and also the analysis that's being done here. So I wanted to just do some of that around an image that really this work reminded me really greatly of, and I think actually a lot of the different pieces of the book are kind of constantly talking to and talking across and things like that. So let me share this, and we'll see if it works straightforward this time, like I hope it will. Okay, can we see that? Yeah.
We could,
how to
yeah.
make it large. See if it works. Is the full image visible? Eduardo, I can see you. Can you nod? It is? Okay, great. Okay, yeah. Good. So I wanted to just reflect kind of on this image, because this is an image actually that, though it was taken before the elections in 2018, it was taken 2016, I think really did become the focus of a lot of discussion in Brazil for very good reasons. And to me, I kept coming back to this image and to so much of what it represents in the ways that the different contributions of the book dealt with so many of these, of the questions around this, right? We have great discussion in the book about the ways that that Bolsonaro really does continue to attend to this idea of Deus, Patria, Familia, right? These kind of three pillars of what he is trying to reconstitute or focus on as a way to reassert a kind of Brazilianness, or what it means to be, Brazilian in this moment, what needs to be reclaimed. And we hear in the book, of course, that's a crisis. It's very contrived. It's something that is created and constructed for particular reasons. We also see in the book that there's lots of ways in which we talk about a critique of this, right? So whose family, right? Here we have an image of a man and a woman who are white alongside a Black woman who is by herself, right? We also don't see a gay family here. We see a heterosexual family. Second, whose nation, right? The idea that somehow there is a Brazilian nation here that encompasses all people is quite well circumscribed by the point here that you have two people wearing, the jersey, and which is a very political symbol in its own way, and someone who's quite excluded from that. But of course, at the same time, is a part of this nation by virtue of her exclusion, right? She is not a part of the family, even though the family very much depends on her as a part of what it can be created, right? And then, of course, we have the church, which is a little bit less well represented here, and the idea of Deus and who is that and what does it mean, present in the ways that we would think about marriage, right, between a man and a woman as enshrined by the Catholic Church, and then, of course, by the state as something that regulates that relationship. But of course, we can see here that there's other things going on, right? We have obscured the perhaps male partner of the Black woman in the image of the empregada. Where is he? Is he present or not? It's sort of axiomatic somehow that he's not there, right? And yet perhaps he's there by a form of forced exclusion, such as the penal populist system that is, of course, further advanced by Bolsonaro, right? That Lilia Moritz-Schwartz talks about in her chapter, right? Of the ways that violence itself is very unequal and impacts particular parts of the population and not others, right? So we have in this image, I think, something that's quite clear, that there's a fallacy of the family in its own way, right? That the white family here, which is seen by Bolsonaro and by this project as being the sort of paragon of what it means to be the family, is being supported and produced by something else which does not exist in that family, right? On the other hand, of course, there's this whole other project of disordering the Black family, right? Which is to say that they're not recognized as family in the same kind of way. Women's work outside the household is very different. The place of the man, as he's seen as a productive breadwinner or what have you, is very different, right? The gay family, other forms of family or kinship are also excluded from this idea of kinship, right? The quilombola, other ways of understanding collective forms of identity are formally excluded from this, from the rhetoric of Bolsonaro's project. Another thing that I think comes very clear in the image and in the book itself too is the way that racial categories have been changed over time, right? So we have the great discussion by Grazia Moraes da Silva about affirmative action, which she and others have discussed about, it's Black people in white spaces, right? And for a pretty important period in Brazil, we have the process of affirmative action that actually does bring Black people into universities, it brings Black people into airports, it brings Black people into other spaces that have been historically white. And lots of discussion by Jaime Amparo Alves and others about the way that gets actively pushed back and quashed, right? At the same time, we have other people talking about the ways that some of the economic advancements and the leveling of some inequalities changed the ability of the white family to afford having Black people in the house, providing the kinds of labor that existed there, right? So I know that Andresa's paper touched on that a little bit about the ways that some of the leveling of inequality changed the very tenor of politics and of who could be involved in these different things. So we have in this moment a way that the process is trying to reassert, right? It's trying to reassert the role of some people in subordination to the white family as a kind of a project and to the nation in a particularly unequal format. So that's a really key part of course, the way that economic mobility was very, very vital to Brazil through Lulismo and then up until, of course, the contrived crisis, which was something very different in which we saw an implosion of many of those things and, of course, a reversion in other ways and in other formats. In the book, we also see very important discussions of the ways that the defense of the church becomes very important, right? As though the church is some kind of moral authority that one can point to as a form of legitimation for the nation and for the family and for the kinds of rhetorics that are used, right? But of course, we have this shift away from the Catholic Church, which has so closely aligned with the project of political order through Brazil's formation, incomplete formation, however we want to think about that process, into the evangelical process, right? Which some people hold as a kind of a steady thing, as though there is an evangelical community itself writ large, when actually it's a very disparate and fragmented movement of people who are away from the Catholic Church and other. So we have this important idea there too, that of course that the idea of the evangelical church is a kind of reformatting or a use of the idea of Deus, because he's not talking about igreja, he's talking about Deus, right? It's not necessarily the Catholic Church, it's those who are Catholic and those who are evangelical, as a means to again reassert the idea of these traditional kinds of categories. At the same time, of course, evangelicalism is important and vital for this whole process because it depends, unlike the Catholic Church, it depends upon redemption, right? It depends upon the idea that you can be reborn, that you can go through varied relationships, you can have colored pasts, you can have multiple wives in different moments, you can be a drug dealer who's been redeemed, you can be like Bolsonaro and have had multiple wives and children with multiple wives and divorces and other moments. And that's all a part of the process. And yet it's still somehow in a hierarchical relationship with God. But that project, of course, still nonetheless excludes homosexual relationships, the LGBTQ community, and all of these other forms of identity and belonging and existence in the country, right? So that's a really important idea there too, that of course this idea of the church is itself a major fallacy, or it's a fallacy that is changing in the way that it's not a traditional category, but it's one that has been modified and used in a discursive kind of way as though it was something coherent and cohesive. We have very well known, churches like the Igreja Universal and others, which are quite paradigmatic, but we have so many more that are decentralized, that are very localized, and that allow for other people out of conditions of abandonment and historical inequality to nonetheless become associated with a form of belonging that matters, that is less hierarchical than, say, the Catholic Church. So then I wanted to just say something, of course, about the fallacy of the nation, right? The idea that the nation is something coherent or cohesive has long been written about by scholars, particularly in the ways that we think about things like Carnaval or music, or the ways that popular images have become vital to how Brazilians and Brazil is understood both internally and externally, right? The Carnaval is the idea, of course, that the morro desce para asfalto, and the music that populates popular culture it comes from varied parts of society, in large parts the margins, to define a lot of the ways that people understand what it is to be or to celebrate Brazilianness. The same could be said of the national football team, which of course is made up of people from particular parts of society, right, and recognized, however, or claimed, however, as being national, even though it's emergent from a very particular set of inequalities. And that itself becomes a very important idea here when we want to contest the way that we understand the nation, right? So Bolsonaro is trying to reclaim the nation as something which is belonging for some at the exclusion of others, whereas, of course, the nation could be something very different for other populations, as we find or seek new forms of belonging and equality, which have been advanced, however haltingly, through government up until the contrived crisis. And that's a really key part of course, this whole process. The book, I think, does a great job of really showing how these forms of exclusion, of inclusion by exclusion, are a vital part of the way that this process has been reconstructed. So I just wanted to conclude then by just by kind of summarizing a set of thoughts here, namely that this book does an outstanding job of showing how the contrived crisis is rooted in efforts to reclaim and reinvest in traditional categories, though these categories have always been a lived kind of fallacy that nonetheless seem to be the basis of what the state does, and of conservative politics. And by that I mean, by conservative politics, I mean a politics of maintenance, a politics of reasserting the status quo, of keeping order, of presiding over inequality. And then of course there are ways in which these categories have been transcended or modified, as in a movement towards evangelicalism, and rebutted in other ways, right? That of course the ways that racial categories have been shifted or changed, understood through affirmative action, through Black people in white spaces, and out of white spaces in other ways, has been quite vital to the way that that equality had changed in Brazil over the last 20 years, prior to, say, 2015, 2016, right? And so I think transcending some of those categories, as the book really describes quite well, is very important for thinking about how equality across spaces, politics and policy, and against the maintenance of egregious inequality that has so defined this country, is a really key way to think about the ways that possibilities, as however halting they are important to think about and to focus on as we all, I think, engage with Brazil going forward. So thank you once again for this incredible book. I think it's a great pleasure to be able to think with it. It's a great pleasure to read it and to see so much of what has been put in by the authors come together in a way that's very fruitful. And I hope really a lot of people read this. I will certainly talk a great deal about how important it is beyond this space here.
Thank you very much, Graham. So Katerina, Eduardo, would you like to say a few words before we move on to questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Linda. Would you like to start, Eduardo, or would you like me to go first?
You can go first, and we'll join you in a couple of minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kadli and Graham. You really brought some very exciting and interesting reflections and like insights into from your reading of the book, which also help us think with them. And I think that if I can draw some common ground between both your comments, I would, yeah, they both made me think of what is so what makes things conceivable, what makes things changeable, what allows for shifts to happen. And Carly mentioned, disputed futures, so contested visions of how things are to evolve or should change, which direction they should take. And of course, Graham mentioned, how notions of social categories like the family, the church, race, even labor, and the nation are shifting constantly. Drawing on the fallacies that the image exemplified, and which I found fascinating. So I think that there are constant shifts, and this is also what we try to show in our discussion. There are constant shifts. Nothing stays the same, yet as many of us tried also to emphasize, and I think the foreword does an excellent job in really pointing this out very clearly. Although many things constantly change, some things change very little, and these are, I think, also perhaps where we should place more emphasis on. These are the things that we might want to think harder about how to deal with, and how to perhaps transform or change in a way that is better, at least for in some ways, and for the majority of the people, I guess. So yeah, it's this constant tension between change and continuity. I think it was pretty came out clearly in both your comments, and I think it was really an essential part of our book. So perhaps, I can let Eduardo say a few words as well.
Yeah, thank you, Graham and Carly. One aspect that Katerina has been mentioning, and we have mentioned in the beginning, is this difficulty we have to conceptualize how something so surprising for many of us, that is this election of Bolsonaro, something that appears new and unexpected, also has so many connections with a history of inequality and exploration and exclusion. So I believe that our effort as a whole, as a whole book, is to take a closer look to the complexity of each situation. Each chapter is written by someone who understands deeply that aspect of Brazil. So who understands the discussion on race, on religion, on economics of the financial philanthropy, as Jessica that I was mentioning before, or on the discussion on politics in not just in capital cities, but in smaller cities as well, as Andressa. So, or Lilia Schwartz chapter that is a more historical view of this inequality. So we managed to get someone from each subject that can deal with the complexity of the situation. That's something that it was really rich for us to have that kind of thing, and that enabled us to see things as as we wrote, as a conservative return, not just a conservative turn. So this, I believe, allows us to move into the comments that Carly and Graham made on the who are we? What are these we that we're talking about? Is this we some idea of a nation, as Graham was pointing out, or is something else? And how we deal with this complexity and make sense of it as a whole we. And place that discussion in light of a temporality. That's something that we were really keen about. It's on Katerina's elaboration of the seminar that gave live to this discussion on this notion of possibilities, of horizon of possibilities or impossibilities. So what is very central here is this unexpected, this novelty, and this something that I called in my own article on the special issue, a radical uncertainty, something that we really don't know how to deal with this, that we don't know what's going to be or what is possible to happen. So Bolsonaro's election and the change that we're living has some novelty in it, something that points to a future that we don't know yet or don't know how to grasp. But at the same time, we felt that we couldn't lose this maybe dialectical nature of the past always coming back. So Lilia's chapter has this title, and the past and present. So the fact that the past is also inhabiting this novelty. So I believe we have a figure like the one Graham also exhibited that has a lot of references that connects with this past as well. So we can see a lot of remains and a lot of novelties at the same time. So this is why I think it was a great image to bring into this discussion, because we really can see in there this complexity, this changing at the same time, remaining the same. So and yeah, I believe it's a picture from the 2016 or something like that, from the Dilma impeachment movement. So it's before Bolsonaro, when we were not expecting Bolsonaro to happen, but it fits Bolsonaro perfectly. So this also, I believe, makes this kind of past and present cohabit or being coeval, what is really amazing. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. So now it's time for questions. Probably the easiest thing will be to raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, or we can put it in the chat. I'm trying to look at both of them at the same time, so it's more difficult. So perhaps raise your hand, but if you want to remain anonymous, please put that in the chat. So it usually goes to the chair to start off the questions. So just taking up this issue of continuity and change, and Eduardo alluded to that before. You know, the title is the conservative turn, but there is also the return of conservatism. So I just wondered as to whether you think this turn, unfortunately, might be either depicts an underlying nature of Brazilian society, or whether it is something that is moving in a direction which is going to be more permanent than we think. So that was just one first question that you might like to answer rather.
Can I?
Sure.
So,
yeah.
My own personal view, I don't know if Katerina agrees with me on that, is that we do have a more permanent conservative position in Brazil that has not disappeared. So it would now appear as something new. My own personal position is that this conservative and this authoritarian tradition, it goes through our history. So what I believe it's different here, there's a lot of differences, as I was saying, the scenario is quite complex, is that it is now more visible. It's not ashamed to place itself in the public sphere and to say things that are really outrageous, like and quite criminals as well. So with very xenophobic demonstrations, homophobic, sexist, racist. So these kind of things, they were always present, but now they are visible, and they are not this conservative trend is not ashamed to make itself visible. So that is something that is really different for me. So I would say that yes, they are here to stay, and now more visible than ever. But maybe it's a kind of radicalization of what they were already doing.
Thank you.
And
Did you want to add anything, Katerina?
Yeah. So just quickly, I think that part of the importance in recognizing the continuities, alongside the disruptions, is precisely to be able to see what may also lie ahead. So if we are able to see Bolsonaro not really as, you know, this out of the blue phenomenon that is unique and so one of a kind, then we might also be able to discern that part of his popular appeal and part of the reason he became, you know, he gained momentum at that specific moment in history is precisely because there are more deep-rooted factors, historical or structural, or we can call them and see them from different angles, that actually made his ascent possible. So as we were discussing previously, while there are constant shifts in society and the way we see things and understand things and discuss about things, at the same time, what shapes what is conceivable at any given moment, what makes it possible or impossible, is a very complex combination of structural and historical reasons, or let's say factors, and specific historical conjunctures, so specific moments that are new, perhaps are very different or unlikely. So when these two somehow come together, then they allow specific events like Bolsonaro's presidency to happen. And by the same token, this can also change very dramatically next year. But I think, again, it's important to recognize what is constant in a way. Of course, within this constant, there are changes, nothing stays exactly the same, but it's important to recognize what is this component that is continuous, to be able to see how this can be, worked with in the future. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We've got two questions now. First of all, Felipe Kraus. I don't know if I pronounced your name correctly. I think you can unmute yourself. Felipe?
Hello, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
I'm trying to start my video. But if that doesn't work, at least you can hear me. So good afternoon. Congrats to the authors, congrats to the organizers of this seminar. Really fantastic book. I think my video, here it is. And quick shout out to Graham, who's my supervisor. I'm a politics PhD candidate at Cambridge. Also quick hello to and congrats to Andressa for her fantastic chapter in this book. Her contribution, I think, is really important to the field of social movement studies, which is my particular field. And she looks at small and medium-sized towns. Too many social movement studies looking at Brazil, but also in Latin America, focus either on rural movements or on very large cities, and for good reason. But she has a very original take on the subject matter by focusing on small towns, and I very much appreciated reading that. So my question is regarding an issue that I'm grappling with myself, regarding the concept of neoliberalism and its continued relevance. I did a quick count, and the word neoliberalism is mentioned 13 times in the book. The word neoliberal is mentioned 32 times. And that is certainly an indication that the concept is still very much present in our discussions. I mean, we have several authors here coming from various backgrounds, all of them, or not all, but several of them mentioning the topic. My questions are, is neoliberalism still a relevant term? In other words, when we think of the shape of the Brazilian state, are the only two options available analytically still the neoliberal one or the developmentalist state is one question. And especially when we're looking at things like the political opportunity structure for social movements, that's an important question to ask. Another sort of interrelated question would be, are all progressive movements necessarily leftist, connected to the PT, and or anti-neoliberal? Can you be progressive without fitting into those categories, and especially without fitting into the category of anti-neoliberal? Thank you.
Thank you. Should we just take another question? Because I notice we don't have a huge amount of time. So I can take the question from Jessie Sclair at the same time, and then we'll get you to comment on both of them. Jessie?
Great. Thank you, Linda. And firstly, just to say a huge thank you to Katerina and Eduardo. It was really wonderful to be able to contribute to this project, and congratulations to both of you for bringing it to fruition, even though it took a long time with all these obstacles in the way. So thank you for that. I hope perhaps my question builds actually quite well on Felipe's. It's not an easy question that has a kind of quick answer, but I wondered what the speakers all thought about how the sorts of debates and discussions emerging throughout the different chapters of this book help us perhaps to rethink or to think in new ways about the PT governments and this period of time. Because of course, one of the big issues for the left, I think, in terms of Bolsonaro's election is, how could this happen following on what had gone immediately before? And although I know there are various answers to that in the book, I wondered, I'd be really interested to hear what you all thought about how some of these discussions might have changed the way you think about that. And also I asked that in a spirit not just of critique and what wasn't achieved under the PT. I mean, I will be the first to jump up and critique Lula's governments on various fronts, including the continuation of neoliberalism, among others. But I also really deeply feel that there were very positive progressive things that happened under the PT as well. And I wonder if you see those still there in some shape or form and helping us to think hopefully about the possibilities for the future. Because I think it's too depressing to think that everything that happened under the PT was for nothing. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you thought about that.
Eduardo or Katerina or Graham and Carly, if you would like to, chip in as well.
May I just say that perhaps we would also like to invite other contributors to the book who are here, if they would like to answer or respond to some of the questions and comments there. I think it would be nice as well to hear from them.
Mm-hmm.
If they are able to not just try to impose or anything, but if you are able to and want to join the discussion and answer that.
Sure.
Can I say something about the PT?
Sure,
question?
Graham. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll pass on Felipe's question because I think it was more directed to the book itself. But so I think others would do a better job of discussing that. I think the question of like the PT government going forward is fascinatingly important because it's impossible to deny that there were so many gains that were made. I mean, there were good reasons that Brazil was a success story, right? I mean, there was broad agreement that there was a leveling and a decrease in inequalities. That's obviously to be much commended. I think there are other ways to kind of think about how a future PT government, if we could hope so far, could be important or could think a little bit more critically about some of these questions. Might be around, say, so I think Lilia Moritz, I mentioned it before, but Lilia Moritz-Schwartz's chapter talks about the inequities and violence. One of the big things that the PT government did was it built prisons. It built a lot of prisons, and it augmented the security infrastructure. And it used that. It created a federal penitentiary system. It mobilized the BNDES to become a financing mechanism for constructing prisons under a debt-based rationale, which is hugely problematic. So that's one thing I think that really dramatically needs to change. And that is, when scholars have talked about neoliberalism, they often say it's this movement towards a punitive approach to politics, right? So we move away from public policies in a broader sense of care, and we divergently associate policies and funding towards punitive things. So that's, I think, one thing. The other thing I would say is that some people have, I think, rightly noted that the inequity in public policies across society have been huge, right? So if Bolsa Familia is something like what, like 17 pounds a month for a poor family, and then on the other hand, you had a great project, which was Ciencias Sem Fronteiras for those who already had university degrees, right? And so those are very different populations, and how they benefit those very different populations means very different kinds of things, right? Which of course needs to be seen in tandem with affirmative action policies and other kinds of things. But I think one would hope, or at least I would hope, that there would be a greater leveling of the ways that these policies would target, perhaps invert that relationship if it had to be that way, right? But at least a kind of understanding that Bolsa Familia could be a lot more than, or a project, a sort of pro-poor project could be a lot more than something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. David?
Oh, yeah, well,
Running out of time, but David, quickly, if you want a question.
well, I mean, the Bolsa Familia was a brilliant public relations success, and it seems to have helped the PT shift its base to the northeast and the north, which may in the end be where some people, I read somewhere that o PT foi morrer no Nordeste. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but it's really small, I think. You know, that's why I say it's a brilliant public relations success. And it's astonishing, not astonishing, but one has to remember the measures that occurred. Oh, yes, sorry. Hi, sorry. I didn't intend to.
But we lost you totally then.
Nice. I was going to say it's nice to see you all, but I suppose I mean it's nice to be seen by you all. You know, a lot of measures such as the tax advantage, the tax deductibility of education and medical expenses, which is a massive subsidy to the middle classes, such as they are, and the upper middle classes, and probably outweighs that. I have to be careful what I say, and bears comparison with the expenditure on Bolsa Familia. And the trouble is that although, of course, Graham is right, it actually, in a way, except for affirmative action, these things turn out not to be sustainable, because it didn't take much for the gains to collapse under the effects of various, you know, economic and political shocks. So if you're going to make redistribution, it has to be sustainable, you know, otherwise it's just forgotten, or at least it's a memory, you know, it's not forgotten, but it's lost in the past. I think Lena Lavinas, I noticed, I just looked at the book actually, thank you, Katerina, for, I had read some chapters of it, but the work of Lena Lavinas is not quoted there. And actually, I think her critique of the economic policies of the PT is well worth looking at. And of course, the affirmative action is embedded in law. The affirmative action, yes, both in universities and in the public service, it's embedded in law. And I don't think actually even now it will be undone. Of course, it needs to work well. It needs a lot of financial oomph, and that depends upon the governments of the moment. And it had it for a time, and actually it was reduced even by Dilma as far as federal universities are concerned, because these beneficiaries of affirmative action need financial support to sustain their studies. I wanted to ask, but we don't have much time. I wanted Graham to talk more about redemption, to say how to explain what was so important about redemption.
I think, David, I love to talk with you about that, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think it's a nice word, but I think it's very hard to grasp.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's no more.
Just to give a proper answer to Philippe on his question on the importance of neoliberalism or neoliberal in the book and in Brazilian situation as a whole, I would say that yes, it is very important, and we do have some chapters that deal with that. So not just us in the introduction, we mentioned the relevance of this aspect, also pointing out how this is part of the change that we see in conservatism from below, something that Flavio Pierucci said in an analysis of the new right in the 80s. He mentioned that the distance from the population and politicians that were putting forward a neoliberal agenda, and how this had no pervasive connection with the population, but now we do have that. So that's something that has changed over the last 40 years, 50 years. And also we have the fantastic chapter by Camila Rocha on the emergence of this neoliberal or ultra-liberal, as she also calls it, movement in Brazil from the beginning of this century until now. So she covers the emergence and how they start and develop this agenda in Brazil. So I do believe this is something really important, and I believe that we can also see how this is connected to discussions on religion, on justice chapter as well. So I believe that it's still important, but we I would also consider that it's important to have a very precise concept, so we don't make everything neoliberal, or don't know the boundaries of what we are saying when we try to point this or that out. So I would also try to make that kind of precision in the argument.
Yeah, if I can come back, I would very much sympathize with Philip.
Very quickly, David. Yep.
No, I've banned neoliberalism from my written output, because for the reason that he said, because there's a deep contradiction. It's both a commitment to free markets, but it also, as we observe, it's in practice, it's a type of variations of crony capitalism, which of course is the opposite of free markets, the capture of markets in many countries, not only in Latin America, but also of course in the United States. Philippon, the economist, whose first name I forget, has written about it. That's all.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the editors first for producing the book, the contributors to the book, and also to our two commentators this evening, without which we wouldn't have had this very interesting meeting. It's quite clear that, you know, Brazil is, well, like most Latin American countries, is incredibly complex. Brazil perhaps more than others, and understanding it is really difficult. I don't know how you managed to write a book when the context is totally changing. You know, I was going to ask a question about, well, you know, what's changed since you started, since the conference in 2018, you know, have your ideas, you know, changed? And grappling with that, I think, is really difficult. It's obviously a book which everybody has to read before the election to try and understand, you know, where we might be going next year. And we are, of course, delighted to have it online. It's free online. So please get it through the CLACS, the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies website, and distribute it to as far afield as you can. So thank you all once again for participating in this event, and I'm sure the discussions will continue. Thank you.